So I had the opportunity to go to the Museum of the Bible when it was brand new a few years ago before COVID. Um, and I would say it's an extraordinary place, which isn't, it doesn't mean that I got a membership. But in terms of trying to understand what it means, why it exists, what its impact and influence, what those things are, how it fits into the landscape of Christianity as the dominant religion in this country, what it has to say about perhaps Christian nationalism, I found to be really illuminating. I was there with a group of rabbis, and Ben Sachs and I were both on that trip, if memory serves. And I remember thinking at the time and talking to Ben, wouldn't it be great to bring a shul trip to this? Because I think it would be fascinating for Jewish folks, for members of synagogues, to understand this phenomenon and also this particular resource that is only an hour away from Baltimore. So I'm really honored that we've been able to partner with Chizuk Emunah congregation in doing this trip. And if you haven't yet had a chance to reserve your spot on the bus for the 19th, I really hope that you will do so. So without further ado, what I want to do now is turn our attention to Matt Taylor. Dr. Taylor is a senior scholar, and he is the Protestant scholar at the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies, where I had the privilege of serving on their board of trustees for many years. He specializes in Muslim-Christian dialogue, evangelical and Pentecostal movements, religious politics in the US and American Islam. He's been on faculty at Georgetown and GW. He had his PhD studies at Georgetown University and also an MA from Fuller Theological Seminary, which is, I'm told, where the other half live. And his book, Scripture People, Salafi Muslims in Evangelical Christians America, offers an introduction to the oft misunderstood Salafi movement in the US by way of comparison to American evangelicalism. He also has a new book coming out this fall, which is The Violent Take It by Force, the Christian movement that is threatening our democracy, which should arrive in fall of this year. There's also a film that Matt and the ICJS put together, which I think is really superb. There was a screening at the Senator Theater a few months back. And we have, I think, supplied the link to that for people to watch the film. And we hope that you will do that as a good introduction to Christian nationalism in a moment where obviously this is not just academic, but really impactful in terms of the American political landscape and otherwise. So without further ado, we're going to turn our attention to Matt. As I said, there'll be time for questions later. Thanks to Beth Am's Lifelong Learning Committee and to our partners, Chizuk Emunah congregation, for making all of this possible.
Well, thank you, Daniel. And I'll just say, Daniel's a friend. He's had us over for Shabbat dinner. My daughter called him Rabbi Daniel Tiger. So we thank you for having me. I'm a great fan of both Beth Am and Chizuk, and I'm just grateful for your partnership and work with us at ICJS. So without further ado, let me share my screen. This presentation that I'm going to be doing today, I'm going to try in the next 35 minutes to give you a broad, sweeping overview of Christian theology and Christian sectarianism over the last 2,000 years. I'll blend in a little bit of Christian Jewish history and a little bit of race history as well in there. So we'll cover a lot of ground. I've titled this the questions that unite and divide Christians. And my goal is to really take you through some of the history of Christian theological debate and how that has shaped the landscape that we see of Christianity in the United States. Obviously, there's a lot more to talk about with Christian nationalism and those sorts of things. So we can get into that in the Q&A. and also on our trip to the Museum of the Bible. If you have questions as I'm going along, feel free to put those in the chat. I'll try to keep an eye on it. I won't necessarily answer every question as I'm going along, but I'll try to get as many as I can in at the end as well. So I want to just start with an experience that no doubt many of you have had, and that is driving around really anywhere in the United States, be it Baltimore, be it rural America, be it any part, any city in America, and just seeing a mind-boggling variety of churches, right? And there's so many different kinds of churches, so many different brands of Christianity that are present in the United States. And so I want to kind of, you have everything from the Greek Orthodox Church here at the top in Bethesda, the Coptic Orthodox Church. What's the difference between Greek Orthodox and Coptic Orthodox? Do they believe the same things, right? You have the St. Peter Catholic Church there. What is the Catholic Church Orthodox, or are those different? You have the First Presbyterian Church, which begs the question, is there a second Presbyterian Church? And how many numbered Presbyterian churches does any given city need? Presbyterians have never quite figured that out. You have African Methodist Episcopal Zion churches, and you'll note the word Zion in there. What is Zion doing in the title of a church? You have these kind of warehouse style churches that you can find in strip malls and in shopping centers that do not have any of the iconography or conventional symbology of a church, and often have really snazzy names like One Life Church or Epic, right? What is that about? What is going on in that space? How is that different than spaces we might recognize as conventional churches? So where do all these folks agree and where do they disagree? And what I'm going to try to do is take you through 6 different moments or eras in Christian history and think about how those moments have contributed to the diversity of churches that we see in America today. And so you're going to hear a lot of terminology, a lot of phrases, a lot of ideas in the next 25 minutes or so. Don't feel like you need to hold on to all of them. Let them wash over you a little bit, just to get a sampling of how complex and weird we Christians are. But there's one word that I want you to hold on to, and that word is the word Orthodox. Now, I know that the Jewish community also uses this word, and it all comes from the same place, but our traditions mean different things around this term Orthodox. So the term Orthodox comes from the Greek orthos and doxa, straight, right, and correct, and opinion, belief, worship, right? It's kind of the range of translations we have with us. And the way that this term gets used in the Christian tradition, at least one of the major way it gets used in the Christian tradition, is around the question of what are the things that Christians must believe and affirm to be Christians? Or maybe another way of phrasing that is, to what conception of deity should Christians direct their worship? Okay, that's how we understand this term. And again, this term is used in Islam, it's used in Judaism. So this is the kind of Christian approach to understanding Orthodoxy. And this is a very, very important question in shaping the Christian tradition, in shaping Christian sectarianism. And of course, the alternative to Orthodox is heterodox or heretical, right? And so what is considered in bounds is what is orthodoxy, and what is considered out of bounds is considered heresy. So the first moment that I want us to think about is the era of the early Christian church, which is roughly the 1st to the 3rd centuries in the Christian era. So this is the world that Jesus lived in, and the world in which the early Christian communities took shape, and the kind of formative period. Now, of course, I'm sure you are all aware that Jesus and nearly all of his early followers were Jewish, right? Jesus is living in the period that historians will call Second Temple Judaism, right? So Jesus is living he's born roughly around the year 0 in the Christian era. The Romans were not that great at calendaring, so we're not sure exactly when he was born, but somewhere around the year 0, probably dies in the 30s of the Christian era. And then, of course, the Second Temple is destroyed in the year 70 CE. So Jesus and all of his early followers are Jewish, and so the kind of bracketing question, the opening question of the Christian tradition is Jesus the Jewish Messiah? Right? Just translating here, the anointed one. And Christ, the term Christ is literally just the Greek rendition of Messiah. So when people call Jesus Christ, they're saying Jesus the Messiah. And so the eventual Orthodox answer, this was somewhat debated in some circles in early Christianity, but basically very early on, all the Christians agree, yes, Jesus is the Jewish Messiah. And so then the logical question that follows from that is, do all followers of Jesus then need to be or become Jews? And it might surprise you, but this is a very, very central debate early on in the Christian tradition. There are real Christian communities that are arguing we are just a subsect of Judaism, and everyone who wants to follow Jesus as Messiah needs to convert to Judaism in order to do so. But then the majority position that wins out early on in Christianity is no. Not all Christians need to be or become Jews. Jews are welcome to become Christians, and they can hold on to their kind of Jewish identity, their Jewish ethnicity, their Jewish culture. But this is a tradition that is open to non-Jews following Jesus as the Jewish Messiah. So then another question that emerges is, how do Christians read the Jewish scriptures in light of their belief in Jesus? Right? How does the belief in Jesus as Messiah become an interpretive lens for understanding the Jewish scriptures? And this is where Christians start talking about something called the rule of faith. And this is a kind of oral tradition from very early on in the Christian tradition. The very beginnings of where you start to see Christian creeds or statements of faith is around this kind of idea of the rule of faith. And so the rule of faith is the orthodox way of reading the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. It's never fully codified or centralized, but this is the kind of way that Christians early on are talking about the Christian way of reading the Hebrew Bible. Now, this goes on for some of these debates and these arguments go on for about 200 or 300 years until you come to the year 325 in the Christian era with a gathering called the Council of Nicaea. And Nicaea is a little town just outside of modern-day Istanbul. So all Christians at this point are believing that Jesus is the Son of God, right? And that language is in the New Testament. But then there's an argument going on by the 4th century, really, by especially early on here. Is Jesus God, or is he a created being? And in the background of this debate is the question of what is the Trinity? And if you've heard this terminology, right, Christians believe in the Trinity, and this idea that there is one God, that's the nitty part, right? That's the unity part, but that God has three persons. That's the tri part. So Trinity is a way of encoding in language 3 and 1, threeness and oneness held together. And so the question that's driving these early Christian debates, though, is really around Jesus and the identity of Jesus. Is Jesus God in God's self, or is Jesus a created being? And there's an early Christian leader, his name is Arius, who arises in the 4th century, and he's a deacon in the church. He's a very respected leader. He's very good at writing little theological ditties, and he's traveling around the Mediterranean world, traveling around different Christian churches, and he believes that he has come up with a solution to this question. He says, I've got it. I am a father, and I have sons. And there was a time that I was a father and I did not have sons, but now I have sons. And so if Jesus is the Son of God, Jesus must be a created being. Just as I'm a father, my sons came from me. They were created by me. And so Arius starts campaigning and saying, there was a time when Jesus was not. So he's not completely and eternally God, and the Son of God is created. And this becomes kind of slogans that are circulating around the world. And so Constantine, the emperor, has recently converted to Christianity, and Constantine decides if we are going to have a Christian religion, it needs to be unified, and we need to all agree on this question. We can't have this big fight between Arius and these other folks. Let's have a council. Let's gather all the bishops of the church, and they come together at Nicaea to have a council. And that council ultimately just rejects Arius's position outright. And they write a creed called the Nicene Creed that is a disavowal of Arianism. And the orthodox position then that comes out of this council is that Jesus is God in God's self. Jesus is the Son of God. And if you find that paradoxical, then you just got to live with the paradox. That Jesus is somehow both God and the Son of God at the same time. That Jesus is the second person of the Trinity and a human being. And this creed from Nicaea gets expanded at the Council of Constantinople in 381. And this is what is still used by almost all Christian churches today. We'll still say the Niceno-Constantinopolitan Creed, which is a mouthful, so we usually just call it the Nicene Creed. And so that becomes then the anchor point for all Christian theology after Nicaea. After 325, the Niceno-Constantinopolitan Creed becomes what is called the ecumenical creed, the one that all Christians can say and agree on together. Now, I don't want to lose sight of history as we're doing this. And so part of what is going on as this is happening is that there's a demographic switchover that's happening between Jews and Christians in the Roman Empire. So if we think back to the era of Jesus, and the term Judaism was in use in the first century of the Christian era, but it had more kind of political connotations. It was more rooted in the Maccabees era. But there was already a Jewish diaspora going on in the first century. It was already present. Jews were scattered around the Mediterranean world. And as this movement of people following Jesus as Messiah emerges, it really is kind of piggybacking off of the Jewish diaspora, or parasitical to the Jewish diaspora, right? Many of the early Christians, Jews made up about 10% of the population of the Roman Empire in the first century, and Christians start out very small as a subset of that, and then these Christian movements and Christian churches begin to be established all around the Roman Empire. And then over time, right, after the destruction of the Second Temple, after the Bar Kokhba revolt, rabbinic Judaism kind of congeals as a tradition without a temple, right? Reconfiguring Judaism around texts. And the other trajectory, though, coming out of the destruction of the Second Temple is what we would call Orthodox Christianity, right? After the Council of Nicaea, particularly, you see what scholars will call the parting of the ways between Judaism and Christianity. This took several centuries. It was not a simple process, but you really do, by the 4th century, have a community that is identified around the rabbis, that becomes rabbinic Judaism, and a community gathering around this kind of Nicene creed that becomes Gentile-centered Orthodox Christianity. And then, of course, and as this is happening, right, Christianity is growing gangbusters demographically, to the point where by the early 4th century, Constantine, it's a savvy political move for him to convert to Christianity because so much of the empire has already become Christian. And then, of course, you have in the 7th century the rise of Islam and the Arab conquests of most of the Middle East. And so what we have in this era is these layers of different forms of monotheism, of Judaism, of Christianity, of Islam, and the diversity that's going on within those communities. But they are all co-located in this Mediterranean, Middle Eastern area. They're all in conversation with each other. They're all arguing with each other. So we come in the third era then is I want to think a little bit about medieval Christianities, these medieval forms of Christianity. And what you see after Nicaea becomes in many ways the headwaters of all other forms of Christianity. And you have the Arian tradition that still persists a little bit after Nicaea, but really kind of dies out after Nicaea. And you have other heresies, other break-off movements, other sectarian movements kind of branching out of the Christian movement, but really often coming to nothing. And so another big debate emerges in the year 431 in a gathering at the Council of Ephesus, and there's a church leader named Nestorius, and Nestorius is anchoring or centering the question: what do we call Mary? Right, Mary's the mother of Jesus, and so people are having an argument in the middle of the 5th century about what do we call Mary? Is she the mother of God? Well, God is eternal, so God doesn't have a mother. Is she the receiver of God? Is she the bearer of God? Right, and so they're having these debates, and so this argument in 431 really centers around that. And Nestorius and his group basically get forced out of the what would become the Catholic Church, and they become the Church of the East. This is still a form of Christianity that exists today, and it's all centered around this debate about Mary. How do we talk about her, and what does that imply about what we mean about Jesus? Now, another question that emerges in the 5th century, this one is at a council called Chalcedon, is the question of how is Jesus both God and a human being? Right? Because the Nicene debate is about how is Jesus Son of God and God. Chalcedon is about how does Jesus both God and a human being. And so this is where you get the breakaway of the Oriental Orthodox churches, the Coptic, Armenian, Syrian, and Ethiopian Orthodox churches. It's a debate about the two natures of Jesus and how they interrelate, right? All of this, though, is still, all these folks are still calling themselves Orthodox. They're just different sects of Christianity with different kind of particularities in their theology, particularly around Jesus. Now, this sectarianism really comes to a head in the 11th century in what is called the Great Schism. And this time it's not a debate about Jesus, it's a debate about the church and who is the head of the church. And so you've had, over the course of several centuries, different geographical centers of Christianity. One in Rome, around the Bishop of Rome, sometimes called the Pope, and one in Constantinople around the Patriarch of Constantinople, and who is kind of a rival figure to the Pope in terms of authority. And so then in the 11th century, you have this split between the Roman Catholic Church, following the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, kind of the Western Church, and then the Eastern Church that follows the Patriarch of Constantinople. There's complicated theology about who is on top, who's the real leader of the church. But basically, the Pope excommunicates the Patriarch of Constantinople. The Patriarch of Constantinople excommunicates the Pope. And you have the schism between the Eastern and Western churches, between the Roman Catholic and the Orthodox Church, or what is often called the Eastern Orthodox Church. So here now we have 4 different kinds of Christianity, major kinds of Christianity populating the world: Oriental Orthodox, Roman Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, and Church of the East. Okay, so simple enough. We've got 4 kinds of Christianity, and then my people get involved, the Protestants. And so we get to the 16th century, and this is where everything just really goes haywire, because the Roman Catholic Church is still ongoing. There's a lot of continuity in this kind of Roman Catholic form of Christianity that kind of persists. But in the 16th century, you really are having, there's really a growing set of debates about who gets to read and interpret the Bible, who has the authority to interpret the Bible, and where does that authority come from? And the Roman Catholic Church is saying, well, we are the Orthodox Church. We are the true church, and the authority of Jesus, the authority of interpretation, gets passed on to us. Obviously, Martin Luther doesn't agree. And so what happens as this debate is playing out is not just that there's one form of Protestantism, there's a bunch of breakaway forms of Protestantism that are all arguing with each other and all arguing with Roman Catholics. So Luther obviously has his fight with the Catholic Church over the interpretation of the Bible and how that interpretation happens. But you also have other groups like the Anglicans, the Church of England, and the Reformed Church, the Calvinists, who are breaking off more over questions of how should the church be governed. Right? Should there be bishops? Should there be a pope? And of course, Henry VIII wants to get a divorce, and the Pope won't let him get a divorce. And so he says, well, why don't I just say I'm the Pope, and we'll create a Church of England, and then nobody can tell me what to do, right? And so this is where you get the Anglican Church, the Church of England today. So you get these different forms of Protestantism, and they're also arguing with each other. They're arguing over things like what is happening in communion or the Eucharist when Christians are eating bread and drinking wine. What theologically, what is happening there? This is a very important debate for these early Protestants in terms of dividing about amongst themselves what is the true form of Christianity. And of course, there's also another form of Protestantism that really gets despised by all the other forms of Protestantism. This is sometimes called the Radical Reformation or the Anabaptists. The Anabaptists are asking even a more fundamental question. When do you become a Christian? How do you become a Christian? And the Anabaptists say this baptism, this entry into Christianity, needs to happen when you're an adult. You need to make an adult decision. You can't do that as a child. You can't just baptize a baby and assume that they're a Christian. Somebody needs to be an adult and make an adult choice about being a Christian. And so they're Anabaptist means again Baptist. They're baptizing people again who are baptized as infants because they say that's the real conversion point. So you get these kind of four branches of Protestantism, four sects of Protestantism that all come out. And then out of those four sects, by the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, they begin to form denominations or subsects of these major branches of Protestantism. So you get things like the Quakers and the Episcopalians and the Methodists and the Puritans all kind of coming out of that more Anglican style of Protestantism. You get the Congregationalists and the Presbyterians coming out of the Reformed style, this Calvinist style. You get the Baptists and the Mennonites and the Amish coming out of this kind of Anabaptist radical Reformation tradition. And of course, the Lutherans are all just call themselves Lutherans because they're all downstream of Martin Luther. But you have all these different forms of Protestantism. And this is happening again in the 17th, 18th century in the era of European colonialism, the discovery of the New World. So all of these potpourri of Protestantisms make their way across the Atlantic and all become embedded within the American colonies. And so you have these different forms of Protestantism that are all present at the founding of the United States. And in fact, I would argue that one of the major reasons that the founding fathers of the United States have institute a separation between church and state, which was a very innovative experiment at the time. Nobody was doing that. This was an entirely new approach to not have an established religion. There were so many different forms of Protestantism that were all arguing with each other, and none of them was dominant enough to become the national church. And the founding fathers had seen how all these sectarian wars, these Christian sectarian wars that engulfed Europe in the aftermath of the Protestant Reformation, that inflicted great suffering on minority forms of Protestantism, they're like, we don't want that. We don't want that chaos. Let's try to forge a separation between religion and state. And so that becomes then the wellsprings of all these different forms of Christianity that we have in the United States that are all, none of which are established, none of which has the imprimatur of the federal government, but all of which are kind of flourishing in this open landscape of the New World. Now, I'm going to ask a rhetorical question because we don't really have time to actually dive in and get your answers. But given what you know about the history of America, right, how do you think race and slavery might impact this already largely Protestant American religious landscape? Right? And if we could do small groups, and I'd love to hear, but we don't have that much time today, so I'll just give you some answers here. It creates even more chaos, and so this really happens in two stages. And so the early stage of this, the early fight is around the question of, can white and black Christians worship together? And I'll give you a hint: the white people are the ones who say no. Right. And so white Christians, white churches, all right, as you have these enslaved Africans being brought over and enslaved in the United States, many of them become Christians. Some of them who are still slaves, some of them who are freed become Christians. And so they do not like, understandably, being second-class citizens in white churches and white denominations and being forced to sit in the back of the church or being forced to sit up in the balcony of the church because there's racial segregation going on. And so these black churches form their own denominations, their own associations. They want black men to be able to be ordained as ministers, and the white churches won't do that. And so this is where you get the African Methodist Episcopal, or AME church, is this pre-Civil War black denomination that's founded out of a very noble impulse towards black dignity and in the midst of white Christian racism. Or the Black Baptist traditions are breaking away from the white Baptist churches so that black men can be ordained as ministers, and so that black Christians cannot be second-class citizens. Now, the second stage of this actually happens very much in the lead up to the Civil War, as you have this debate playing out among American Christians between the North and the South, between the enslaving South that is wanting to enshrine that enslaving practice in theology, and the abolitionists in the North who are pushing for the end of slavery, right? Both sides of that debate are Christian. And so the fight then becomes about, can Christians own slaves? And this leads to a fracturing of almost all of the major Protestant denominations in the United States fracture between North and South in the decades before the Civil War. And so you get the Northern, the Methodist Episcopal Church, and the Southern Methodist Episcopal Church. You get the Northern Baptists and the Southern Baptists. And by the way, when you talk about Southern Baptists today, that denomination goes back to this pre-Civil War era when there's this schism around abolition and around slavery. And the Southern Baptists form because they want to maintain the right of Baptist ministers and Baptist missionaries to own slaves. That's why the Southern Baptist Convention exists today. Now they've repented of that in certain ways, but that still exists in that schism between other forms of Baptists and Southern Baptists. So when we come back to, and this is we're getting into our sixth era. This is we're nearing the end of our whirlwind journey here. And when we come back to these different forms of Protestantism, especially within America, all of this feeds into the contemporary debates that we're seeing. So you have all the old Protestant Catholic and Protestant disagreements from the Reformation. There still are radical Reformation Protestants. They usually just call themselves Baptists today. There still are Lutherans. There still are Presbyterians and Congregationalists. There still are Methodists and Episcopalians and Quakers and Amish and Mennonites. All these things still exist. But what starts to happen is in the 20th century, new coalitions form amongst these different groups that in some ways supersede the denominations. And so what we see happening even in the 20th century and is still kind of an ongoing process today is these questions of that have animated the past debates are still present. And so you now have different forms of Black church, of Black Protestantism that have kind of congealed into what we would today just call the Black church. But there's all kinds of different Black churches, most of them Protestant, a few Catholic, but the different Black churches all have their own traditions, right? Their own beliefs, their own theologies that have been shaped in this sectarian context. You also have another debate that emerges very prominently in the 20th century. What should the mission or focus of the church in the world be? And so this becomes the split between mainline Protestants and evangelicals. Mainline Protestants take the side that the church exists in the world to do justice. And so the mission of the church is to build justice in society and in the world. The evangelicals take the approach, the mission of the church is to convert people. The mission of the church is to proclaim the gospel and to bring more people into the church. And so that becomes its own kind of coalition. And all these denominations, so there are Presbyterians who are mainline Protestant, there are Presbyterians who are evangelical. There are Congregationalists who are mainline Protestant, Congregationalists who are evangelical, right? It's no longer that the denominational identities are clearly demarcating things. It's more about these bigger coalitions. And in the 20th century as well, a whole movement emerges that says, well, we've talked a lot about Jesus, but what about the Holy Spirit? What about the third person of the Trinity? We need to focus more on that. And in the early 20th century, a new Christian sect, a new Christian movement emerges called Pentecostalism that focuses especially on the Holy Spirit as the third person of the Trinity. And so this is the landscape that we are still living with today, especially in the United States, which is still so dominated by Protestantism, where you have these major coalitions of Protestants, but you also have the old debates and the denominations that are all layered together, all chaotically kind of moving around each other. And I'd like to leave you with this image. So if we think of Christianity as a delta, as these branching streams of theology and community and practice, Nicaea is in many ways the wellspring of that. It's the source where all of these debates downstream are flowing. And by the way, there are a bunch of non-Nicene forms of Christianity as well that have emerged more recently. So the Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, is a non-Nicene form of Christianity that emerges in the United States in the 19th century. Or the Jehovah's Witnesses, a non-Nicene form of Christianity that emerges again in the 19th century. But you have these four major branches of or I guess you could say 5 major branches of Christianity: the Church of the East, the Oriental Orthodox, the Eastern Orthodox, the Roman Catholic, and the Protestant. And then, of course, you have all the madness of Protestantism, all the different ways that Protestants have fought and had schisms amongst themselves. And then you have, but all of that is present. You have Eastern Orthodox churches in the United States. You have some Oriental Orthodox and Church of the East churches in the United States. You have a lot of Catholic churches. In fact, about 23 to 25% of the US population is Catholic. And then you have these Protestants, all these amorphous, wild forms of Protestantism. And all of this, again, is driven by this question of orthodoxy. All these folks are claiming that they are Orthodox, that they have the right form of practice, and they, on some level, that the others have it wrong, right? That the others are somehow missing the mark. And the question, I think, the great question of the 21st century for Christianity is, can Christianity tolerate a multiplicity of orthodoxies? Can all these groups work together? Can they all recognize each other as forms of Christianity? And what unites all these forms of Christianity is upstream of the diversity that we see today, right? And the relative importance of these different disagreements among Christians have varied over time. And right now, the divide among Christians is much more about politics than it is about theology. But theology is always layered in there. And in some ways, I would say the moment that we are in right now in the United States and American Christianity, the best historical analogy that I can have is that era right before the Civil War, where it's become about politics, it's become about race, it's become about slavery and about Christian nationalism, and it's become about how do American Christians understand themselves in relation to the nation state, in relation to Christianity, in relation to global Christianity, right? All of these are kind of the live wires that are driving the polarization that we see in Christianity today. So this is the world that we're living in. And when you come to a place like the Museum of the Bible, which is largely founded by and for evangelicals, and is participating in different ways in some of these debates about the relationship between the American churches and the American nation state, this is all context for being able to put yourself in that space and understand why that place is so political, why that place is controversial, and why it's worth paying attention to, whether you're Christian or not. So Sharon asks, what different attitudes do those groups have toward the Jews? We've got 18 minutes. I'll try to give you a 5-minute answer. That is a very complicated question. So by the way, if you want to go deep on that question, I taught a course at ICJS last year, actually just about a year ago, right this month, on Messianic Judaism and Christian Zionism, where it's a 3-session course. It's all on YouTube, on our ICJS YouTube channel, that you're welcome to watch if you want to understand this in some more depth. So the question of Jews in Christian theology, there's a backward facing dimension to that question, and there's a forward facing dimension to that question. The backward facing dimension of that question is historical, and it's about both the Jewishness of Jesus in the early church and how Christians understand that, and then the history of Jewish-Christian relations. And to put it very, very simply, up until the 20th century, almost all Christians viewed Christianity as we will use the term supersessionism, or a replacement of Judaism. They saw Judaism as God's work in the world 1.0, and Christianity as God's work in the world 2.0. And that Christianity in some ways makes Judaism irrelevant at best and inconvenient at worst, right? And so there's deep channels of Christian supersessionism, of Christian anti-Judaism. This is where a lot of the resentments between these traditions emerge in the ancient world. And then as Christians become more and more demographically powerful, they begin to persecute Jews because Jews are theologically inconvenient. And then that spirals and congeals into Christian anti-Judaism, Christian anti-Semitism, and then you have, of course, the Holocaust downstream of that. The other side of this, though, is more the future-facing piece. That is more about what role do Jews and Judaism and Israel play in what Christians call the eschaton, which is just Greek for the last things, the end of time, and the role of Judaism and Israel at the end of time. And really, once you have the emergence of Protestantism and all these different proliferation of different Protestant interpretations of the Bible, starting in the 16th century, it really kind of throws the conversation about Jews and Israel into a much more chaotic and kaleidoscopic dimension and dynamic. And today, broadly, American Christians have a positive view of Jews and Judaism, but it's very, very complicated in terms of how they think about Israel and the view of the future and the role that Jews and Judaism play in the future. And so just to boil it down very simply, most evangelicals believe that Israel has a role to play in biblical prophecy, that the Bible prophesies in their interpretation a restoration of Israel, of the state of Israel, and the ultimate conversion of all the Jews at the end of time to following Jesus as Messiah. And so evangelicals tend to be more Zionist, but then their Zionism is not necessarily always pro-Jewish, right? They're not pro-Judaism per se, they're pro-Israel. And so, because they're envisioning the eradication of Judaism at the end of time. And because ultimately they think Jews are insufficient as long as they remain simply Jews. They need to follow Jesus as Messiah. And so Messianic Judaism is an evangelical movement trying to facilitate the conversion of Jews to Christianity. But then most of these people are also pro-Israel because they see that as being the fulfillment of Christian prophecy. Mainline Protestants, it's a much more mixed bag in terms of whether they think Jews and Israel have any role to play at the end of time. And but then most mainline Protestants have Jewish friends. And so it's more, I would say mainline Protestant tends to be more pro-Jewish and neutral or anti-Israel. And evangelicals tend to be more pro-Israel and neutral or anti-Jewish. And I'm speaking very broadly there. So there's tons of nuance to be had in that, but that's the big picture. What influences, if any, has non-US European-based Christianity had on the different lines of Christianity, or has it been a one-way flow of precepts outwards? No, it's today the center of action in global Christianity has shifted from what we call the global North, the US and Europe, into what we call the global South, South America, Africa, the subcontinent, Southeast Asia, and the majority of Christians today live in the global South, not in the global North. And so that is reconfiguring global Christianity even as we speak, and the influences of the global South, the theological voices, the demographic power of Christianity in the global South is changing Protestantism, is changing Catholicism in ways that are not always predictable, and it's probably going to take another century or two to really be clear exactly how that shift is changing things. But because these movements are transnational and global, you really do have a flow of ideas and leadership and practices that is global. And today, global Christianity is very much impacting American Christianity. I think we need to get out of the mode of thinking of American Christianity as some sort of hegemonic power that's exporting theology and ideas. It's also importing all kinds of theology and ideas from around the globe. And the question of what role Jews and Judaism play in that is really fascinating. I mean, in fact, Christian Zionism today, so Christians who are very much in favor and supportive of the state of Israel. Christian Zionism today is no longer anchored in the US and Great Britain the way that it was historically. Now it's anchored in Brazil and South Korea and the Africa and the subcontinent and right. So you're the ways that Jewish Christian relations play out or have played out in the US, it's very different globally. And a lot of the folks that you'll see showing up, a lot of the Christians who show up for different festivals and things in Israel are coming not from the US or Europe, but are coming from other parts of the world and are shaped by other forces within Christianity there. Okay. How did things change from believing Jesus was the Messiah to believing Jesus was the Son of God or God? That's that's a great question. Both these ideas are in the New Testament, so early Christianity, it's not really a question of whether Jesus is the Son of God. That idea is there from the earliest moments of the Christian tradition, the earliest times when these Christians are gathered together. The debate is actually more about how do you understand Jesus being the Son of God and being God in relationship to being a monotheist. How are we still monotheists if we believe that God has a son, essentially? And that's what the doctrine of the Trinity that takes, again, several centuries to congeal is trying to do, is trying to offer a theological framework for holding together a belief in Jesus as the Son of God with the belief that Jesus is God and that God is one, right? How do you hold that together? That's what the Trinity is trying to do. In terms of Jesus being the Jewish Messiah, again, Jesus, as far as we can tell, Jesus as a historical figure made that claim himself, that he was the Messiah, or at least the earliest traces that we have historically about Jesus indicate that he was making that claim himself. Now, of course, there are many people who claim to be the Jewish Messiah in the end of the era before Jesus and the era after Jesus, right? But Christians kind of attached themselves onto Jesus and then interpreted the Hebrew Bible through the lens of Jesus and through the Jewishness of Jesus. Of course, then they had to reckon with the fact that most Jews didn't adopt Jesus as their Messiah. And a lot of the kind of lingering resentments within Christianity towards Judaism actually come from that early fracture. The sense, well, Jews killed Jesus. They didn't. The Romans killed Jesus. Jews rejected Jesus as their Messiah. Jews forsook the covenant that God made with them because they didn't follow the Messiah. And so therefore Jews are theologically invalid and we inherit the promises of God. That's the tradition of Christian supersessionism, is to push aside Judaism for the sake of kind of a Christian theological claim. If there's a widespread view that Judaism has been superseded, how do all those Delta offshoots of early Christianity explain Jesus' appearance in the world as a Jew and not a follower of Zoroaster or the Buddha, et cetera, et cetera? Great question. So since the Holocaust, a lot of the scaffolding of the theology of Christian supersessionism has been dismantled. And so a lot of Christians today recognize there are some really problematic elements to all of this discourse about Christian supersessionism, Christianity inheriting the promises that God made to Israel, that sort of thing. And so there have been a variety of different movements, theological movements, to try to reconstruct forms of Christianity that are no longer supersessionists, that accept the validity of Judaism. Now, again, that can go in two different directions, right? Because the mainline Protestant and Catholic approaches have tended more towards validating Jews and Judaism, but not always supporting Israel, because they don't see Israel as biblical per se. They don't see Israel as necessarily theological. They just see it as another nation state, and then they have complicated feelings about that nation state. On the evangelical side, that forsaking of supersessionism has tended to mean we embrace Israel as a fulfillment of biblical prophecy, but then want to see all the Jews converted ultimately. And whether that happens now or at the end of time is an intra-evangelical debate. There's been a lot of theological work recovering the Jewishness of Jesus since the Holocaust. The cutting edge theology that is being done today among Christians on these questions really does kind of assume the Jewishness of Jesus and tries to locate Jesus in his Jewish context. But then you have to also grapple with this reception history of Christians abusing Jews, persecuting Jews, hating Jews theologically, hating Jews literally. And so there's been a lot of Jewish Christian dialogue. I mean, even the Institute for Islamic Christian Jewish Studies was founded in many ways to try to address some of these questions locally here in Baltimore. But it's an ongoing conversation among Christians, and there are about as many permutations of that conversation as there are forms of Christianity. Traditional Judaism views the Messiah as a human. So when and how does that change in the Christian belief of Jesus? So as I was saying, from the very earliest moments of the Christian tradition, Christians are both saying Jesus is the Messiah and Jesus is the Son of God. The Messiah piece is never really controversial within Christianity. From the earliest moments of the church, people are saying Jesus is the Jewish Messiah. The Son of God piece becomes then the thing, or the God piece becomes the thing that ignites a lot of these arguments among Christians early on. But
Matt, can I maybe just sort of expand that question a little bit
Oh
that
yeah, sure.
Avi asked, because I think for Jews, I think maybe what we're getting at here is that it's odd to us that anyone would think of a Messiah as the Son of God or as God. So maybe is it possible to say a word or two about how that shift might have happened between the way Jews understood our concept of the Messiah arriving and how Christians so early understood him differently?
Yes. So and again, there were different views of the Messiah in Second Temple Judaism as well. So it's not that all the Jews in Jesus's time had one conception of the Messiah, and then they were all kind of in disagreement with this Christian offshoot group. It was actually a lot more complicated than that. There were different conceptions of the Messiah in these different forms or sects, or what Josephus calls philosophies of Judaism, that were existing in Jesus's time, right? You had the Essenes, you had the Pharisees, you had the Sadducees, you had these kind of zealot proto-nationalist types, and they all have kind of different conceptions of Messiah. Jesus seems to have landed on a distinct conception of what the Messiah is in his own interpretation of the Hebrew Bible, especially in his interpretation of the prophet Isaiah. And so Jesus seems, again, as far as we can reconstruct historically, seems to be the one who originates this Christian style of understanding the Messiah as this figure who suffers and dies. At least according to the New Testament, which we don't have very many other historical documents to base any conclusions on, early Christians are also from the earliest moments saying that Jesus is God. And that seems to have been something that Jesus himself at least tolerated, or maybe acclaimed himself. And so these Christian conceptions originate very, very early. But the Christians recognize that there are tensions within the Jewish tradition in understanding Jesus or understanding the Messiah as God. And so what happens very quickly within the Christian tradition is they start looking to Greek philosophy to understand this. And so the Trinity is more constructed out of Greek philosophical frameworks than out of Hebrew Bible interpretation. And so what you get, because again, Gentiles are coming in to the community, so you get the Christians tend to be more open to some of these Hellenic philosophies, Hellenic ideas, where the rabbis, of course, right, who are operating around the same time, are much more kind of resourcing the Jewish tradition, Jewish text much more intensely. And the Christians are much more interested in resourcing these Greek traditions in order to make sense of this. And so that becomes some of the divide early on, is between these kind of Gentile Christians doing their theology and sometimes blending that with the Hebrew Bible versus the rabbis. They're doing more their own trajectory. And that becomes, again, part of this divide, this parting of the ways between Judaism and Christianity. Okay. In your own experience, what, if anything, that locates itself outside the circle of belief disrupts the strident certainty that is a, or perhaps the hallmark of fundamentalism? Wow. I've got 2 minutes. So fundamentalism is a term that's actually coined among American Protestants in reference. It's kind of a form of American evangelicalism. I was in some ways raised in communities that would have identified as fundamentalist, although that term has fallen out of vogue now. How do you disrupt the certainty? If you can come up with a good answer to that, I'd love to hear it. Because part of what we are seeing right now in the dynamics around Christian nationalism is these layers and layers and layers of Christian theological certainty expanding and being attached to now the US Constitution, being attached to US history, being attached to conceptions of nation state. Some of that, frankly, is attached to Christian nationalists in the United States model their conception of what a nation should be off of Israel and the Hebrew Bible. That is a part of their attachment to the state of Israel. Is Christian nationalists understand God's idea of what a nation should be, that ancient Israel is the model, and that God is supposed to be in charge, and that the religious groups are supposed to be in control on some level in society. That's where they're getting these ideas largely. How do you disrupt that certainty? I guess I'd ask if you've seen anything in your communities that can do the same, because we are living in a time, and polarization drives this dynamic where people live in their silos, only talk to people in their silos, become more confident of their positions in their silos, and then demonize people on the outside of their silos. And I mean, part of what we do at ICJS is trying to have dialogue between people in their silos, and dialogue is the best tool I've found for breaking up that certainty and helping people ask some questions and having a little bit more epistemic humility. Yeah, somebody had.
Just want to add, that was my question. You know, we have in the Jewish tradition, we have a tradition of skepticism, and Gornish Helfen, it's not exactly helping us right now either.
Yeah, there's definitely traditions of Christian skepticism. I mean, the Enlightenment itself is in many ways an evolution of Christian skepticism, and a willingness among some Christians to challenge the status quo, to challenge certain doctrinal certainties. And there still are plenty of Christian voices doing that today. The penetration of those doubts and the dialogue into the mainstream or the majority population is minimal, and so you still have a lot of Christians, especially in a place like the United States today, who feel quite confident in their Christianity, quite confident that their Christianity is the real Christianity, quite confident demonizing their opponents, and facilitating dialogue amongst or with those folks is very, very difficult. Those people don't tend to darken our doors at ICJS very often.
Matt, do we have time for maybe one last question?
Sure. Yeah. Do you want me to take one from the chat?
Sure.
Okay. So what books would you recommend if we want to learn more? That's a great question. If you want to go deeper on some of this question of parting of the ways and the relationship between Judaism and Christianity, I highly recommend the work of Daniel Boyarin. He's a Jewish scholar who specializes in early Christianity. He has a good book called Borderlines that really is thinking about this parting of the ways, and how the simple narratives that we have today about this separation between Judaism and Christianity is actually much more complex when you look at the history, right? That there were Jewish forms of Christianity and Christian forms of Judaism that persisted a lot longer than we sometimes imagine they did. And that even today, I mean, Messianic Judaism is laying claim in some ways to the legacy of some of these early forms of Jewish Christian blending. That doesn't mean they're not a problematic community. I taught a whole course that you can go to and see the ways that I critique Messianic Judaism and its approach to these things. But it's a real thing within Christianity for Christians to feel an affinity and connection with Jews. I assume Ben will talk about this a little bit next week. But when we think about anti-Semitism in the Christian tradition, we always have to hold that in tension with what we call philo-Semitism in the Christian tradition, right? That Christians, the Christian love and affection for Jews, and in some ways, both anti-Semitism and philo-Semitism in Christianity are shaped by the Christian imagination of what Jews are supposed to be, the theological imagination of what Jews are supposed to be. And the pattern of Christian history is Christians imagine Jews to be a certain way because of the way the Christians read the Bible or imagine Jesus and as a Jew. And then, and often that's positive. It's often a positive imagination of Jewishness. And then they encounter actual Jews who don't fit their imagination, who have their own integrity and are not just kind of Christian caricatures of Jews. And Christians become very disappointed with that. In fact, when the Talmud was translated into European languages in the medieval period, Christians were shocked because they were like, hey, this wasn't what we imagined Jews were. This is very frustrating. And this led to then all kinds of pogroms and anti-Judaism, right? So that's the pattern that recurs throughout this history and the power dynamics between these two traditions. A lot of what I try to do is get Christians to actually talk to Jews and have conversations with Jews and encounter Jewish ways of thinking, encounter Jewish interpretations of some of our shared texts. One of my favorite resources that I recommend to Christians, and I would recommend it to you all as well, is the Jewish Annotated New Testament. So this is the New Testament, which is Christian scripture, but it's a commentary on the New Testament, a study Bible on the New Testament, written by Jewish scholars, not Christian Jewish scholars who work on Judaism in that period and are putting these Christian texts in context of early Judaism. And Daniel Boyarin is a contributor there. Amy Jill Levine is one of the editors of that project. I really do recommend that. I think it's a wonderful resource for bridging between these two communities and recognizing that some of these debates go back a lot farther than today, and that there's a context that we all need to be able to understand in order to have dialogue.
Great. So please join me in thanking Matt Taylor for really an excellent entree to understanding Christian sectarianism, but also pointing us toward our next talk and our museum trip, which Matt and Ben Sachs will be leading. So just a little bit of housekeeping. The next lecture is a week from today, but at a different time. It'll be at 7:30 p.m. on the 16th. And that will be Ben Sachs, the Jewish scholar at the ICJS, doing Can We Separate Philo-Semitism from Supersessionism? And then on Sunday, the 19th, is the museum trip. If you haven't signed up for the trip, please do that. Even if you are planning on meeting us there, we'd like to know that you're coming. So if you're not reserving a seat on the bus but want to meet us in DC, that's okay. But I think meeting on the bus is going to be the easiest way to do it. As a reminder, we'll meet by 8:30, please, in the Chizik Amuna parking lot. The bus is leaving at 9 o'clock promptly, so don't be late or you will miss the bus and have to get yourself to DC. And then we'll get to the museum around 10 a.m. It'll be kind of a self-guided visit to the museum, though obviously Ben and Matt will have prepared us for it and will be available to kind of ask questions and point things out and say, isn't that weird, or isn't that interesting, or isn't that surprising? They'll be our docents and guides. And then lunch is in the details if you signed up, so it's kind of on your own or eating vegetarian in the cafeteria there. Don't take the Eucharist by act. No, I'm just kidding. And then we'll be taking the bus back to Chizik Amuna, and we'll have a little bit of time to unpack what we learned there at Chizik. So we'll get back approximately 3 o'clock. We'll have some light refreshments, and we'll have a chance to kind of ask questions, share a little bit of what we learned from the day. So this should be really extraordinary. Ben, Matt, we're so grateful to your willingness to do this with us and for us. And everybody, hopefully we will see you next week for the second lecture.